So in this video, you'll learn about the basic structure of the United Nations. In the background here, you'll see an organization chart of the United Nations, all of its agencies, all of the bureaucracy, offices within the United Nations. And you'll notice that the United Nations is a huge bureaucracy, huge administration. There's a lot to keep track of. So let's try to simplify this conversation, this lecture, by just going over each of the 6 bodies or organs within the United Nations. First, we're going to talk about the General Assembly. Second, we'll discuss the Security Council. Third, we will learn about ECOSOC. And then after that, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the Secretariat, and then finally the Trusteeship Council. You'll notice that there are 6 organs within the United Nations structure. However, there are only 5 active ones, and that's because the Trusteeship Council was dissolved of in 1994. So let's get started. You can think of the General Assembly as the legislative arm or branch of the United Nations. So this is where states come together to communicate with one another, coordinate actions, to agree to specific collective action on political, economic, social, or legal issues. So sometimes the topic at hand might be climate change. Other times it might be development and sustainability. And other times, like this upcoming September, I'm sure there will be conversations about world health in the case that there is a pandemic going on. Okay, I should mention that there are 193 members of the UN, and specifically 193 voting members of the General Assembly. However, I want to point out that there are some territories that you and I might think of as states, such as Palestine, that are not technically members of the UN. And as a result, they don't have any voting power. Alternatively, Palestine is considered an observer to the UN. Now, this is because the Security Council has to vote by a supermajority to recognize a territory as an independent sovereign nation and admit it as a member of the UN. Well, so far, the UN Security Council has not been successful in doing so. A couple other things that I want to point out about the General Assembly. There, again, like I said before, is an annual meeting in September. This is kind of considered the Super Bowl of diplomacy. This is when not just ambassadors to the UN, but heads of state travel to New York to address other world's leaders. And most importantly, this is when all of the drama happens. So be sure to keep track of what's going on at UN headquarters in September. Last thing I want to note, when it comes to resolutions, oftentimes there is only a simple majority required to pass a resolution. Let's say that resolution is on development or climate change. However, there are other times in which a supermajority is required. And that is when there are budgetary issues being discussed or non-permanent members are being elected to the Security Council, or lastly, people are being elected to ECOSOC. Okay, so in some cases you need a simple majority, other times you need a supermajority in order to get things passed through the General Assembly. Let's move on to the Security Council. I'm sure you've already heard quite a bit about the Security Council. Notice here in the picture, it's a much smaller room than where the GA meets, and that's because there are only 15 members of the Security Council. There are 5 permanent members for the Security Council: China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and lastly, the United States. I want you to notice, what do all of those countries have in common? Well, those were the winners of World War II, or at least these particular countries were not devastated by the fighting that happened in World War II. And lastly, these countries had nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. So this is why these particular countries are permanent members, and in addition to that, we have 10 non-permanent members that serve 2-year terms. Okay, so right now, for instance, Niger is on the UN Security Council. Germany has a seat, Vietnam, Indonesia. You can look up the rest of the list online if you'd like. Okay, so for the UN Security Council, in order to pass a resolution, you have to have a 3/5 majority vote in every case, unlike the GA, where sometimes you only need a majority vote. And that's because the issues that the Security Council is dealing with on a regular basis impact the global community immensely. At the end of the day, the Security Council, right, exists in order to use non-coercive diplomatic means in order to preserve peace and security. But also, sometimes the Security Council is willing to use coercive force. So if the Security Council passes a resolution to use coercive force in a particular territory, they oftentimes establish a peacekeeping mission somewhere. And currently there are over 100,000 UN peacekeepers all over the world. In addition to that, there are 13 current peacekeeping missions. One of them, for example, is in West Africa in a country called Mali. There's another UN peacekeeping mission in the Congo, and then several other peacekeeping missions in parts of Latin America and Asia. So the decisions that the Security Council makes should not be taken lightly as a result. One last thing, though, that you need to know about the Security Council is that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council can veto a resolution that is in front of the Security Council. So let's say that 14 of the 15 members of the UN Security Council want to authorize a peacekeeping mission in Syria, but just the United States vetoes that resolution. That means it doesn't pass. It doesn't happen. We don't send UN peacekeeping forces into Syria as a result. So this is why the 5 permanent members are so important, and this is why the Security Council is oftentimes controversial. There's a lot of dissent. There's a lot of controversy. And one last little thing I want to note is that, not surprisingly, Russia and the United States have exercised their veto power more than the other permanent members of the UN Security Council have. Next off, we have ECOSOC. So ECOSOC is an acronym. It stands for Economic and Social Council. Primarily, ECOSOC is responsible for development and humanitarian agendas in the global international community. With that, ECOSOC has 54 member states, and those particular member states are elected for 3-year terms. And like I said before, they're elected by the General Assembly. In addition to that, each region has equal representation. So there are an equal number of representatives from the African continent, from Latin America, North America, so on and so forth. Resolutions are passed by just a simple majority. And the last thing I really want to underline about ECOSOC is that when you think of all of these agencies that you have already heard of before, the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the Food and Agriculture Organization, all of these agencies, commissions, they are a part of ECOSOC, or they are under the umbrella, the auspices of ECOSOC. Moving on, we have the International Court of Justice. I'm not going to spend much time on this, and that's because the ICJ has a lot of symbolic influence over the international community and member states, but doesn't, well, we could argue about this for a long time, but doesn't have a lot of real power and authority over disputes in the international system. So the ICJ is the only body or arm of the United Nations that is not located in New York. Instead, it's located in the Netherlands. And the ICJ is primarily responsible for settling disputes between states. However, these disputes, these points of contention, conflict, have to voluntarily be brought to it by states, by member states. And in addition to that, whatever recommendations the ICJ makes, these member states volunteer to follow them. So you can imagine that the ICJ is oftentimes not very effective in actually enforcing international law. That's not to say it's a completely useless arm of the United Nations. There are times, for instance, when war crimes are perpetrated by prior heads of state and they are tried and found guilty at the ICJ and are put in jail or prison for the rest of their lives for those crimes committed against humanity. So Charles Taylor, the previous kind of authoritarian dictator of Liberia, is an example of this, if you'd like to look up more information about that. One last thing to note, there are 15 judges that serve 9-year terms, and those judges have to be elected by the General Assembly and the Security Council. Then we have the UN Secretariat. When you think of American politics, we have 3 branches of government. We have the legislative, the judiciary, and then the executive. And the president of the United States is in charge of the executive. Well, the UN Secretariat is similar to that. The Secretary General you can think of as almost like the President of the United States. This particular individual is appointed by the General Assembly, and this person oversees much of the bureaucracy of the United Nations. So the UN Secretariat is in charge of all sorts of things that are necessary to making sure that the United Nations is able to realize its goals. So the UN Secretariat can set agendas. There's a lot of research that goes on at the UN Secretariat, a lot of reports. And in addition to that, the UN Secretariat is in charge of making sure that member states are communicating with each other. The UN Secretariat is in charge of communicating with the press and the media. And lastly, the UN Secretariat is responsible for coordinating and communicating with non-state actors that still have a lot of influence in the international system. So think of a nonprofit organization like Save the Children or World Vision or Oxfam. I'm sure you're familiar with those organizations. The UN Secretariat is responsible for including those organizations in these conversations. Lastly, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the Trusteeship Council is the 6th unit or arm of the UN. However, it has been suspended since 1994. The organization itself still exists, it's just that it doesn't meet anymore. And the Trusteeship Council was set up originally at the signing of the UN Charter in 1945, and it was designed to help countries, mostly in the developing world, establish their independence and become members of the United Nations. So this particular body of the UN was an important part of the decolonization process that happened after World War II. But in the 1990s, members of the council decided that because decolonization had, for the most part, been successful and completed, the council wasn't necessary anymore. So there you have it. Let me know if you have any questions.